It's my honor to be introducing our next keynote speaker, Krittika Ghosh. Krittika is currently the Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Islander Domestic Violence Resource Project in Washington, D.C. She's been working to end gender-based violence in immigrant and refugee communities for the past 20 years through innovative programming in both Canada and the United States. Krittika's experience on ending violence against women stems from her extensive work with immigrant communities ranging from direct services to community engagement, organizing, advocacy, policy development, and program management. She is the co-founder of the Shakti Peer Group in New York City, a peer engagement model in response to violence against women in South Asian communities. Until recently, she managed the Violence Against Women's programs at the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, and was a member of Ontario's Roundtable on Violence Against Women, advising government on issues relating to gender-based violence. Krittika has been widely recognized for her leadership and work in ending gender-based violence. She holds a bachelor's degree from Simon's College, Boston, and a master's degree in gender studies from the London School of Economics. Please join me in welcoming Krittika.
Good morning, everyone. Feels like I'm here for the Oscars, but I can talk a lot longer and you won't cut me off. So I'm here to talk to you about how to use an anti-racism, anti-oppression framework to prevent and end gender-based violence. I just want to start off by recognizing that we are in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I want to thank Eva BC for inviting me to speak to you at the Beyond Me Too Supporting Survivors Changing Culture Conference and Training Forum. It is incredibly heartening for me to see so many of you here today. Also makes me nervous. The room, I'm assuming, is filled with service providers, advocates, policymakers, community organizers, and survivors with multiple identities. I want to take a moment, and I want you to take a moment to recognize what a powerful group of people you all are, and give yourselves a round of applause for all that you do. It is not often that the work that you do gets the recognition it deserves. Through your work, you're bringing about individual and systemic change to end gender-based violence, and it takes a lot of energy to do this work on a daily basis, and I know it. And let's be honest, very few of us are doing this work for the money, right? I'm here today speaking to you from a multiplicity of identities. As a queer immigrant woman who is also a survivor of gender-based violence, as someone who has been doing gender-based violence for the past 20 years in North America, and as someone who, despite working in the movement and the nonprofit industrial complex for so long, despite my youthful looks, still believes in the ability for social movements to lead to social change. It's very easy to kind of become what's the word for it, kind of give up on the idealism. Like I had a different sort of idealism when I started out at 21 than I have now at 41, but it's still there. In my remarks today, I will be focusing on talking about how to use an anti-racism, anti-oppression framework in our work in multiple ways. In direct service work, how many of you are direct service providers? Raise your hands. Great. How many of you do community engagement work? And there could be intersections. The same people could be raising their hands many times. And policy work. How many of you do policy-related work? Okay, a few of you. How we can use this framework within our agencies as a tool to ensure equity and sustainability of our work. I will be using examples from my work to describe ways to use ARAO in everyday life and in our work. And I'm going to actually switch to some of this, share some of the slides at this point, because this was actually for my workshop in the afternoon, so we can get rid of it for the workshop, but I feel like this is needed to set a framework. Remind me, how do I forward the slides? Oh, this is the okay. Okay, so how many of you have you used an ARAO framework in your work or are aware of it? Okay, some of you. So in terms of the anti-racism, anti-oppression framework, you may be wondering, why do we need an anti-racism, anti-oppression framework? Nearly all Canadians are immigrants or descendants of immigrants or refugees, except Indigenous peoples of this land. But this fact does not prevent differences of race and class for dividing Canadians into separate groups. Immigrants, refugees, and members of racialized communities face multiple systemic barriers to full and equitable participation in the economic, social, and political life of Canada. For immigrant refugees and racialized women, racism, poverty, economic inequality, violence, and marginalization are amongst the most dominant predictors of poor health. So, in terms of racism, when I use the term racism, it refers to the fear, hatred, or discomfort around racialized individuals and communities. And it can take place at different levels. In the interpersonal, it happens on an individual level, and it can be easy to dismiss. It doesn't have to be overt, like being called a racial slur by a stranger on the street. It can be very subtle as a microaggression, for example. If I walk down the street and people make assumptions about me based on how I look physically. Institutional racism includes policies, practices, and institutional structures that impact racialized individuals' lives, experiences, and access. For example, an agency's policy that doesn't allow service dogs on the premises impacts those who need that support from accessing it. And systemic racism refers to a conscious or unconscious belief that excludes and marginalizes racialized and indigenous people. And this morning we heard from Shelley about how in specific ways it marginalizes indigenous folks. Yeah. Oh, too loud. Okay. Oh. When we talk about racism, we have to talk about anti-racism, because where there is an issue, there has to be, a form of responding to it. So anti-racism looks at how racism functions while creating the groundwork to take action to eliminate racism. It involves understanding how race and racism negatively affects Indigenous and racialized peoples at each level that I mentioned, examines power imbalances between racialized and non-racialized peoples, including how they offer unearned advantages and privileges to those in the dominant group, and develops actions and strategies to eliminate or address racism. And it's really important to recognize that anti-racism requires examining one's own self, and the space that we take is important. And that includes for those of us who are racialized as well, because many of us, for example, as immigrant, non-Black racialized folks, still have, racism towards people, towards Black people. So that's something that we need to really be mindful of. So it's not just, it permeates through all levels. In terms of oppression and anti-oppression, because we're talking about ARAO, so where is the oppression and anti-oppression in this? Oppression is the use of power to marginalize or disempower an entire social group or category, while often while it further privileges the oppressor. And anti-oppression refers to strategies, theories, and actions that challenge socially and historically built inequalities and injustices that are ingrained in our systems and institutions by policies and practices that allow certain groups to dominate over other groups. So an example of this is a recent finding that came out that states that people with ethnic sounding names are less likely to be hired over people with Eurocentric English sounding names. So example, the difference in hiring somebody named Juan versus somebody named John. And that's something that exists in Canada, despite all that we say about equality, and the study was here. So coming back to me as a person, I recently returned to the US after spending 8 years in Toronto, and the one question I'm asked by people in both countries is why? Why did you return to the US under the current political conditions? And the answer is a complicated one, but when it comes to political ramifications, I think it is important to have as much resistance as possible to the fascism that we are currently experiencing through the Trump government right now. It is also important for me to use my current platform as the executive director of an agency serving immigrant and refugee women to ensure that I get to highlight how the policies, laws, and bills developed by the current government are adversely impacting those who are the most marginalized. So I'm here today to talk to you about how to use a feminist, intersectional, anti-racism, anti-oppression lens to prevent and end gender-based violence. I don't have a solution to end gender-based violence, PS. But I do think that the ARAO framework is a critical one for us to use and examine and think about in responding to gender-based violence. We cannot talk about feminism, intersectionality, or ARAO without acknowledging the work of Black and Indigenous women who have created key frameworks of analysis and are at the forefront of the movement, but whose work is not recognized and has been replaced by liberal white feminists. In 1989, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black feminist legal scholar who is currently a full-time professor at the UCLA School of Law and Columbia School of Law, where she specializes in race and gender issues, became the first person to use the word intersectionality in the context of feminism. She introduced intersectionality as a way of framing various interactions of race and gender in the context of violence against women. Intersectionality recognizes the multiple systems of power that affects aspects of our individual identities that cannot be separated. And anti-oppression refers to the strategies, theories, and actions that challenge socially and historically built inequalities and injustices that are ingrained in our systems and institutions. An anti-oppression framework starts from the premise that privilege and oppression exist within society, resulting in an unequal access to power. This unequal access to power results in privileged groups gaining greater access to information, resources, and opportunities, whereas those groups that are oppressed experience the opposite. There are groups in our society that clearly possess more power than others. For example, cisgender, able-bodied men, especially white men. There are others, including Black and Indigenous women, immigrant and refugees, LGBTQIA folks, people with disabilities, those with low English proficiencies, those who are working class, working poor, who are marginalized both in the larger society as well as in our anti-violence movement itself. So what does what does the anti-oppressive practice look like in anti-violence work? This is something we're asking ourselves all the time. How can we do our work in ways that recognizes the power and influence that we have? How can we make our services as accessible as possible? How can we respect and recognize the local territories on which we work? What does it mean to do anti-violence work in a colonial society? How can we address multiple forms of violence and not just focus on the way that, let's say, gender informs our work as an anti-violence organization? What kind of privilege do each of us have, and what kind of power do we hold as an organization? And how can we use our privileges and power for social justice? I'm going to try to address these questions in my talk today using my personal experiences as examples. After all, the personal is political. My first job out of college many years ago was at a small South Asian domestic violence organization in New York City. I'm not going to name names, but if you Google it, you'll find everything. But my position was one as a program assistant who provided administrative support to the executive director. Because of my language skills and someone who had experience working with the survivors of violence against women, my work included doing intakes and referrals to Bengali and Urdu speaking survivors. I was young, I was passionate, and I thought I was going to change the world. One thing that really stood out to me as I was doing this work was that while the survivors that the agency served included women of diverse religious and social backgrounds, including Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and Hindus, working class new immigrant women with precarious status and limited English proficiency skills, the staff and the board consisted of predominantly upper class, upper caste Hindu women with professional degrees. While the intention of these women was from a place where they wanted to help survivors, it was also also coming from a place of hierarchy, of women with power and privilege who were extending a hand to those with less power, but not to the extent that survivors were in a position of decision making as staff or board members. A few years before my joining the agency, there had been a split between survivors who were low-wage domestic workers, who were also survivors of intimate partner violence, and the founders of the agency, who were the women with professional degrees and upper-class background. This resulted in the creation of two other agencies that did work on organizing, specifically on domestic workers' rights. Although I ended up working at the domestic violence organization, I also volunteered for one of the domestic workers agencies and eventually was on the board of the other. 18 years down the road, the domestic violence organization continues to exist and thrive. The two domestic worker agencies that did groundbreaking work to support low wage workers experiencing economic, physical, and other forms of violence eventually shut down due to lack of funding. The domestic violence organization eventually expanded its staff and board to include women with more diverse background in terms of religion and country of origin, but it still remains very homogenous in terms of class, sexuality, and doesn't provide focus on providing services to the LGBTQIA community or survivors with disabilities. The reason I tell you this is that the experience of working with these agencies made me think about my own positionality while doing anti-violence work. I was a 22-year-old who thought I knew so much from being a sociology and women's studies major, only to be pulled down to earth by the survivors and organizers that I was working alongside. While I had always been aware of the class and caste disparities in South Asian communities while growing up in India, I became more aware of how they were exacerbated after immigration to the US. Over 90% of the women who were being abused in their places of work were working for fellow South Asians who were doctors, lawyers, businesswomen, and diplomats. I was questioning my presence in the labor movement as someone whose family did come from a privileged background. What I realized is that it was important for those who had lived experience to be at the forefront of the movement for social change. It was not my position as a college educated young woman to lead survivors or to put myself in a leadership role. According to Audre Lorde, the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. I realized that it was not just enough for me to recognize my positionality, but to see how through that I was adding to unequal power dynamics. I saw this through ways in which, even in the labor rights movement, there were people with class privilege who spoke English, had access to funding, taking over from those with less privilege. For example, in one of the agencies I was a part of, those with class privilege had access to media and funders, whereas the low wage workers who were doing the organizing work were doing it without any recognition. It was only through the passage of time that I saw how problematic these dynamics are and the need for recognizing that even those of us who are marginalized tend to oppress others within our own communities. This was also a situation which shows that there is a difference between intention and action. While we all have good intentions, we need to practice reflectivity, especially in our positionality and its impacts. In my interaction with the members of the labor rights organizations, I saw survivors who had not just experienced workplace violence, intimate partner violence, but were also organizing and mobilizing around these issues. They were doing outreach in restaurants, grocery stores, hospitals, clothing stores, beauty salons, and other spaces where they had access to community members who would most need access to their services. They organized protests outside the workplaces of abusers, got legal support for survivors, publicized the cases in local and ethnic media, and ensured that survivors got compensation for their loss. It was clear to me that survivors were resilient and had the capacity to organize within their communities in supporting fellow survivors, as well as leading to systemic change. This was in opposition to what I had experienced in the VAW movement, where survivors were recipients of services but did not often have input in them, or were used as tokens to talk about their stories when it came to speaking out in glittery galas or fundraisers, but not as change makers in the movement to end violence against women. After seeing how the mainstream violence against women agencies that worked in the South Asian community replicated forms of oppressive hierarchies through their structures and work, I wanted to create an alternative where survivors were leading the movement instead of just being recipients of services. This led to the creation of Shakti Peer Group, a peer-based, membership-based organization of survivors who were mobilizing their community to educate them on intimate partner violence from within the community. The members of the groups were all Bengali speaking, predominantly Muslim, working class women, including survivors of intimate partner violence and workplace sexual harassment. One peer had extensive experience working internationally and ending gender based violence, and one was an interpreter in a hospital. Several were from labor organizing backgrounds, and one was a homemaker who left her house alone for the first time when she first started attending our workshops. Initially, the purpose of the group was that it was going to be a short-term project for an agency that I was working for at that time. I was going to train the peers train the peers on gender-based violence and how to organize around it. Then they were going to do a series of trainings and outreach in their community. At that time, there were no similar projects that recognized survivors as possessing the knowledge and skills to be agents of change. When I had brought up the need to have survivors as part of the movement as advocates, with advocates and in doing outreach, I had constantly been told by so-called experts that survivors did not possess the skills and strength to do the work and that they were too vulnerable. Through my work with the community members in the labor movement, I knew this was not true and understood it as a form of gatekeeping to ensure that those with power stayed in power and did not include others, especially those who are most marginalized. It is also a way of maintaining the status quo, and this occurs in all communities. Does it sound familiar? Yeah. While it's easy to pinpoint when this happens in predominantly white spaces, it is especially painful when we see it occurring internally within BIPOC communities. As I started the process of training the peer group members, I realized that this was a two-way learning process where we shed our traditional roles as mothers, daughters, wives, sisters, and discussed how those roles can be spaces of both celebration and oppression for women in our communities. We talked about the forms of violence specific to our community in terms of gender role expectations and how they were limiting, how we experienced multiplicity of oppressions from racism, sexism, classism, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant attitudes, as this was just a few years after 9/11, and also what the peers were experiencing in their own lives. One of the peers, I can't say her name because just out of confidentiality, she had left her two children in Bangladesh 10 years ago and was working as a domestic worker in the Bronx and would send money home to them. She had missed key incidents in their lives, such as college graduations, weddings, the birth of her grandchildren. She had overstayed her visa, and if she went back home, she would not be able to re enter the US. Despite experiencing so much in her life, including previously working for oppressive employers, she kept on mobilizing in her community through her work with multiple organizations. In the trainings, we talked about problematic representations of beauty and body image in our communities. We had eventually talked about more taboo topics of sex, consent, and sexuality. While I was facilitating this training as a 20-something-year-old, I was also going through a tumultuous time in my personal life when I came out to my parents as being queer at the same time. It didn't go well. I also did not know if I could share this side of who I was with the peers based on my own stereotypes of older community members as being conservative. When I eventually did come out to some select peers, they were there for me in ways that my own family could not be, by accepting me and acknowledging my relationship with my then partner with a legitimacy that my biological family never did. After completing their training, the peers ended up doing outreach in spaces where mainstream South Asian agencies had never reached out to before: community groups, community fairs, places of worship, community centers, because they knew their own community. They built relationships with other grassroots agencies doing work, including the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, which had a predominantly South Asian male membership. The peers hosted a community health fair in which they talked about domestic violence in Bengali. They also hosted tea or chai parties in their homes, which led to intimate conversations on the issue. Eventually, the peers trained the next group of peer champions the following year and spoke about their work and strategies in both local and national level conferences and spaces. The group shifted in its composition to a membership based group where the peers decided on the name, vision, mission, and decided on the visioning and strategy of the group. The reason I tell you about this process is to emphasize that if we are talking about using an ARAO framework in GBV work, it must include survivors' input on all level of the work. How are we ensuring that the services we are providing are actually survivor-centric and survivor-specific? How are we ensuring that our work is not just quote inclusive in a tokenistic way, but we are actually actively thinking through our positionality and reflecting critically on how we are both including and excluding certain groups? For example, many mainstream agencies, even those who work with culturally specific communities, don't train staff on working with LGBTQIA survivors or survivors with disabilities. I have heard many excuses for that, ranging from lack of funding to the fact that queer, trans, and survivors with disabilities are not accessing their services, so there is no need for such trainings. This is not okay. This is not a legitimate reason not to have supports in place. It's assuming that the only people who will ever access our services are able bodied heterosexual people, and also sends the message out that may lead to survivors not sharing their invisible disabilities or disclosing other parts of their identity, including their sexuality. I invite you to reflect on what barriers might a person experience before getting to your agency, like environmental, technological, information and communication, transportation, etc. And once they get to your agency, what barriers might they experience, such as attitudes? Even if no one from these community ever accesses your services, staff need to be equipped with the knowledge of serving survivors with multiple identities. Those of you who do direct service with survivors, I am sure you recognize how you have so much to do with so little. Your work is not linear because healing is not linear. Survivors who access your services after contacting you after multiple incidents of trauma and violence from family, intimate partners, people they trust, and sometimes strangers. At DVRP, which is the agency I'm currently working at, the survivors who contact us are mainly new immigrants with precarious status who have low English proficiency. Many have children. They are isolated, financially vulnerable, and are contacting us out of need. Our roles as advocates are not to provide a neat one-size-fits-all solution, but to provide options for the survivors and recognize that whatever they choose to do, it is their decision, and our intervention comes only when asked by the survivor or when a child's life is in danger. Recently, DVRB became one of 12 agencies across the US to receive grant funding from the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund to work on the Me Too campaign. I'm going to drink some water. Oh. The funders recognize that how, until now, the Me Too movement has been a movement where white women's voices have been amplified. Our Us to Immigrant Women Speak project includes training low-wage API workers, so that's Asian Pacific Islanders, to reach out to spaces they occupy in their communities, including places of work, worship, and social gatherings to talk about workplace sexual harassment and the legal and non-legal options that survivors have for support. Asian Pacific Islander immigrant women, particularly those who are undocumented and those with limited English proficiency, have huge barriers finding sustainable work with fair wages. The risk of losing a job, the threat of detention and deportation due to their precarious status in retaliation to reporting is a barrier in reporting sexual assault and harassment in the workplace. API women experience high levels of poverty. While the national poverty average in the US is 15%, almost 24% of Nepalese women, 19% of Cambodian women, and 17% of Thai women are under the poverty line. When we set out developing this project, we wanted to ensure that we were equipping community members with the tools to support each other and provide forums for survivors to share their stories anonymously or publicly. It is important that we change the narrative to show how pervasive workplace sexual harassment is and the challenges that racialized immigrant communities experience in particular. It is absolutely essential that those of us who are working in the GBV sector get training from an ARAO framework. Some basic ways to ensure that our work is using an anti-oppression analysis when it comes to direct services includes ensuring that survivors are a part of the board and staff, and not just from a tokenistic manner to fulfill a quota, but in a meaningful way that includes inclusion in all aspects of the organization. Ensuring that survivors have access to support, including trauma therapy. At DVRP, all staff have access to a therapist who helps us develop self-care plans and provides us with energy healing therapy sessions. And we build that into our grant applications. When developing new projects, reach out to the community, including survivors, to get their input, and also ensure that you can support their being there in terms of childcare, transportation costs, interpretation, including ASL, and a meal. When developing projects, think about how you are acknowledging staff and community members. Don't just use the labor of people without acknowledgement. I once worked for an agency, which I won't name, where staff were not recognized publicly or in materials, and it can be very dissuading to those who spend their energy in this work. In many cases, it is a lot of racialized women who are doing this work in particular. Also develop meaningful partnerships with other agencies who can help support your work, provide training for staff, and collaborate so that you're not reinventing the wheel. I know that in Canada and also in the US, we are fighting for the same pot of money. For the larger agencies, which already get a ton of funding, ask yourselves, are you the best agency to do this work, or can a smaller grassroots agency use this funding to sustain themselves? Over the years, my work has shifted gradually from doing direct services to creating community based programming, which leads to change in beliefs and attitudes, to ensuring systemic change. My work at the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, or OCASI, gave me the opportunity to both develop large scale community based interventions as well as to work towards systemic change, and I'd like to share some thoughts on both. 2 years ago, I developed a project telling our stories, immigrant women's resilience. The project included the creation of a multilingual graphic novel with 4 stories on sexual violence. And those of you attending my workshop will get a copy. I will be speaking more about this in the workshop in the afternoon. However, the success of the project resulted from the graphic novel being created by immigrant refugee women themselves through writing workshops. It resulted in discussions about various forms of sexual violence, including workplace violence and marital rape. Um, and it was used in workshops and discussion groups across Ontario. We were supposed to disseminate 17,000 copies, and I think at the end of the workshop, we had disseminated over 50,000 copies. When developing, and this was multilingual, so it was in 11 different languages. When developing tools for the community, including trainings, brochures, and other materials, it is essential to have the buy-in of the community members rather than having an expert develop them. I had a lot of conversations with people in positions above me who were like, why don't we just hire, a writer to write this for us? Why do we, need to go into so much trouble to do these workshops? But that to me would not be a project from the community for the community. Community members are the best experts and know what they need. Make sure that people with lived experiences are an integral part of the development process of educational tools and campaigns. Because we might think that we have this great idea, but when you actually implement it and you don't get the results that you thought you would get, then it's because the people who actually would use these tools were not consulted. Also, make sure that you provide them with support and don't further traumatize them in the process of developing these tools. Because in developing these tools in the workshops, survivors, mostly the people who have participated were mainly survivors who really talked about their experiences, and that can be it can be healing and traumatizing. So you have to have supports in place for them. When we talk about gender-based violence, we have to acknowledge that survivors experience multiple levels of violence and oppression, including systemic violence. It is clearer to see systemic violence in a country such as the US, where under the Trump administration, we are moving towards a system that celebrates white supremacy while negating the experiences of women, people of color, Black and Indigenous communities, people with disabilities, LGBTQIA community members, and more. This list could go on and on. The rollback in the civil rights of survivors of violence has been swift. The Muslim ban is resulting in the further vilification of community members. It's resulting in higher incidence of Islamophobia. The very identity of transgender community members are being questioned and threatened. And the US is on its way to prevent survivors of intimate partner violence from applying for asylum based on their experiences of domestic violence. This is because experiences of violence, women's experiences of sexism, Islamophobia, and the experiences of identities of trans folks is being negated. It is clear that we are living in a society that is upholding white, cis male Christian privilege through the institutions that are enforcing laws that challenge the very existence of other identities. Just recently, so many of us were glued to our screens watching Dr. Christine Blasey Ford testify. Here she was, a white woman with a PhD who teaches at a university, who spoke calmly even after being questioned after hour in a manner which clearly questioned her experiences and memories. When we witnessed Dr. Anita Hill go through the same process 27 years ago, she did not have the same level of support and was chastised for daring to bring down a black man from his position as Supreme Court Justice. This is a clear example of systemic violence which challenges survivors, particularly those with multiple intersectional identities. Survivors experience this on a daily basis, from not being able to report to the police out of fear of detention and deportation based on their immigration status, to not having access to supports in their languages, to experiencing their abusers speaking for them, to law enforcement officers and making it seem that they are the perpetrators, to not being believed when they do report and seek support. Um, I will say that there's this assumption that things are a bit better in Canada, but we here to see thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, being unreported, or when they are reported, not much is being done to support the community by the federal government. There is also no national access without fear policy in Canada, so survivors with precarious status are afraid to come forward and report. Law enforcement, including judges, lawyers, the Crown, police, do not receive consistent training on how to work with survivors of gender-based violence, and if they do, it is not always from an intersectional lens. The lack of knowledge on gender-based violence leads to further violence against survivors when they do seek support and help, and they are often re-victimized. There is also an elevated risk that faces people with disabilities in Canada. According to Stats Canada, 83% of women with disabilities will be sexually assaulted at least once in their lifetime in Canada. People with disabilities are 2 times more likely to face physical violence than people without disabilities, and women are 2 times more likely to end up in relationships that are emotionally, physically, or financially abusive. It is also important to note that a huge portion of assault against people with disabilities in Canada comes from the health sector. People in positions meant to aid people with disabilities in their independence, such as personal support workers, attendant care services, and so on. Black, Indigenous, and people of color also have heightened risk of violence when looking at the disability demographics in Canada. As a member of the Ontario's Provincial Violence Against Women's Roundtable, which was unfortunately recently disbanded by the Ford government, boo, I got to see how those of us who work in the government can provide key recommendations and changes when it comes to policies and practices. Each of you has experience working in one community or another, and has the capacity to push for systemic change. In terms of changes that we need to push for, I would recommend the following. Measure statistics, data, and ensure that you do evaluations of your projects, and then push for further funding for GBV work. Show the need and push for accountability when GBV work is not financed on the same level as other issue areas. We also need to think about who's collecting the data, what questions are being asked, how is the data being interpreted, and how are we using that data to bring about change. Push for GBV training from an ARA lens for all service providers, including law enforcement, those working in public health, and those who work with survivors. See who is in spaces of decision making. Oftentimes, when I would be in spaces where in Ontario, when I would be in spaces where those working with GBV issues were present, I would be one of very tiny minority of women of color. This is not okay. Also, women of color, Black and Indigenous women, should not have to constantly push for having a seat at the table. And while we're at it, let's just break the table and have a circle. Um, um, Write an op-ed on the policy issue that you feel passionately about. A few years ago, I co-wrote one on the need for access without fear policy in Ontario. Nowadays, through the power of social media, you don't have to reach out to traditional news media to be heard. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can sustain our movement while recognizing the problematic hierarchy of power and control that exists in the nonprofit industrial complex. I don't know about you all, but the work that I can do can energize me, but also exhaust me. Most of us are doing this work for reasons other than monetary satisfaction, like I mentioned. I've personally found that the internal power dynamics of nonprofits, especially those who do anti-violence work, are often replicating systems of violence themselves. We talk about creating safe spaces in our communities, but that does not often result in such spaces being developed in our agencies. Or there may be policies and protocols around ARAO which are never followed in practice. My personal response to this has been varied. I have organized with fellow staff members to create more equitable workplaces. I worked in agencies that are unionized so that staff have more accountability from management. I have also, and this has been the most case, I've left abusive work environments after being completely burnt out. Now that I am in a position of power and management myself, I have to constantly remind myself about how creating spaces for my colleagues to thrive both professionally and personally is essential to their growth and the growth of the organization and the movement. When we talk about ARAO, we need to ensure that our workplaces are following an ARAO analysis when it comes to our policies and practices. Some tools to include in the hiring process, ensure that those with lived experiences, Black and Indigenous women, women of color, LGBTQIA folks, people with disabilities are strongly urged to apply. Think about what you actively do to recruit them. Have a note at the end of the job posting saying that you're an equal opportunity employer is not enough. In the interview process, ensure that you take into account people's lived experiences over just academic learning. Those that have navigated the system know best what challenges survivors experience. While degrees are helpful, they are not everything. In the staff policies, make sure that you have policies related to anti-discrimination and sexual harassment policy. The government has created a federal disability law that will be important for the work that you do. Take a look at your board composition and see what communities are being represented and who is missing. For example, at my current agency, that is a pan-Asian agency, we are very South Asian centric in the board composition, whereas the staff and survivors are Chinese, Vietnamese, and Japanese. At each board meeting, I am like a broken record bringing up how this is problematic. But eventually, this will hopefully change. Also, think beyond what is the typical value added characteristic. Most recently, we recruited a Filipina woman on our board who is a survivor and an artist. The board wanted the typical lawyer or an accountant, and I had to point out how having someone with her skill set is an asset now that we are moving towards more and more in doing trauma therapy related work. Be open to thinking outside the box, it might surprise you. Think of the way that you interact with staff, colleagues, community members, and people in your agency every day. Try to foster an atmosphere of support, mutual respect, and one where we are in the movement to end GBV together. The GBV movement is not a new one, and unless we break down patriarchy globally, along with addressing racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and other forms of xenophobia, we are going to be continuing with this work for a long time to come. What has changed is how we do this work and who leads the movement. Today, anti-violence work is being done both on the streets, in our community, online, through social media, in government, through the work of grassroots nonprofit organizations, in schools, and most importantly, at home. How do we continue doing this work while also building a sustainable movement and also sustain our lives? Building leadership is essential. Throughout my life, I have seen certain celebrity activists or folks in power hold on to their positions for decades on end without sharing their knowledge or power with others. This is also a form of gatekeeping and is oppressive. It leads to people scrambling when the celebrity activist or long-term leaders does step down eventually because there isn't someone to take their place. When we think about building leadership, it needs to be on an intergenerational scale. We often see resources poured into building leadership of youth or young people. However, we need to do the same for adults and elders, many of whom who had to start new careers in Canada after immigrating here, and in many cases have to start all over again. I am a strong believer in mentorship. When I was in Toronto, I would get requests from women of all ages who were looking to work in the GBV sector and didn't know how to begin. I would schedule coffee meetings and share what I had learned from my experiences and also refer them to meet other people I knew. This is particularly important to do in for immigrant refugee women, many of whom who have no work connections in Canada. Pay equity is something we all fight for and believe in. Yet the compensation scales for the work that so many of us are doing is really dismal. As we can see, most of the people who do anti-violence work are women, including women of color. A few years ago, Ocasi did a survey with member agencies to find out how much frontline workers across the province were making. And it was shocking to see that the average hourly rate of case managers was $13 an hour. This is not sustainable. As a new ED, I see how precarious the work is as well as the funding. However, it is still important to recognize staff for their time and work and compensate them accordingly. In my first 3 months as ED, I gave my staff their first raise ever in the history of the agency. To me, this was really alarming because that this was the case. We need to ensure that before we support others, our basic necessities in life are also being met. Other ways of acknowledging staff include showcasing their work in public, attributing to their work rather than claiming it as one's own, and providing staff with opportunities to grow through trainings and title changes. We need to practice anti-oppression within our agencies first before preaching it to others. One of the simplest yet most difficult things to do is to look within one's own practices of anti racism and anti oppression. We all have power in some spaces and don't have powers in others. For example, when I'm in spaces that are predominantly occupied by white straight folks, my identity as a queer woman of color is further manifest. I also occupy power through my position as ED and as a person with a master's degree. The reason I bring this up is to acknowledge that many of us here are non-Black people of color, and while we definitely experience discrimination and racism, our experiences of racism are different from what Black folks experience on a systemic basis, where Black men are being carded on the streets, where they're being killed by police on a regular basis, and where we can count the number of Black leaders in our sector on one hand. Being mindful of our positionality should also lead us to reflect on how, except for Indigenous folks, we are all settlers here on Indigenous land, including those of us who are immigrants and refugees. We are occupying space that has been taken forcefully from a community that has lost access to their land, language, and culture. In doing GBV work in Canada, we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women, but we have to think carefully about how we can be allies to those from the community who are fighting to ensure the safety of the community members. As you can see, anti-racism, anti-oppression framework is one that permeates all aspects of our lives, from the personal to the political to the movement building, from frontline services work to policy work and beyond. It is a tool we need to adapt if we are to create a just and equitable society. I encourage you to leave this space thinking about how you can utilize it in your own life and work. Think through, when do I need to step up and step back, and what does it mean to hold space? I'll leave you with one of my favorite quotes by author Arundhati Roy. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing.